Welcome to Sam's Antique Motors. Sam Wilson here. Today we're working on putting the front axle back together. So in the previous segment here you saw me taking that thing apart. I've now got everything pretty much cleaned up, remachined, all the bolts parkerized, and now I'm ready to put it back together. By way of a little practice, I put this side together first. When I say practice, that's because I had to put it together, then take it back apart, and then put it back together. But I've got it all in place. It all seems to be working nicely. Got the nice resistance there. Got the hub on. Only thing I need to do is put the cap on, but I'm going to go ahead and paint the black in the inset before I do so. So that's pretty much the passenger side. I did make this little dolly. Just took a few minutes to it's 40 inches out to out, so I took a couple of 2x4s, I took a couple 18-inch 2x4s, I had a scrap piece of plywood, so I drilled a 4-inch hole, split it in half, and I'm using my rear end stand to tear the rear end down, so I made this little dolly so I could move it around. I've got all the parts here, for the most part, laid out in the order they go to put it back together. This is the planetary gear knuckle, and from there I got the bushing, the bronze bushing that goes at the top, not the bottom. Learned that the hard way. I've got these bearings greased up. I packed these when I packed the rest of them just so I wouldn't have to get dirty again. I've got the inner bearing in here, the race and seal installed. Again, I packed those before I put them together. All the nuts and bolts have been parkerized, so these are a nice gray finish. Not sure that's the way they would have come from the factory, but I suspect it is. Got all these pieces. The one kind of cool little trick here is this is the snap ring that goes, actually it goes on the end of the axle shaft. I have to go get the axle shaft. This was only on one side. I'm trying to get something in the background so you can see it. This was only on one side. The one side didn't have it. This side was on the other side, and I never got it off. I finally beat it off. And then in trying to figure out how to properly do it, I found the manual for this planetary gear, and seems the right way to do it is beat it off. So I couldn't find this snap ring. What I did find out is that if you buy an 1.5-inch key ring, I tried a couple of sizes. This is an 1 3/8. This is just your standard key ring. This is made out of spring steel. 1.5 inch turns out to be the right size. If you take an 1.5-inch key ring and just cut it off, then it's the right diameter and the right size to replace that little spring. So I've got that prepared to go back in. I was unable to find any gaskets, so I made all the gaskets. I just got gasket stock. Most of these gaskets are about 17 thousandths. The gasket around the felts is about 13 thousandths, so I bought different gasket material for that. And everything's really pretty much ready to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and start assembling this up, and I'll take a little video as I go. So I got this all cleaned up, and when I put the other one together, I made the mistake of tearing this down upside down, and then I'm putting it back together right side up. So I studied photographs to make sure I had everything on the right side, right, and everything matching the pictures, except it was upside down. So in my lack of slumber last night, I was trying to think through why the bearing was on the top as it was in the photographs, because to me the logic sense would be the weight would be pushing down on the bearing and you'd want the bearing on the bottom, which is actually the way it works. So in thinking that through, I realized I put it together backwards. So the first thing to do is I recommend you tearing it down in the same orientation that you're going to put it back together. But once you do that, the little bronze bushing right here goes on the top. And there's an oil groove or grease groove in there that, and there's a grease dirt in the plate that is at this on this side. It's actually the steering arm. So there's a grease dirt in there to allow this to get greased. So first thing, make sure you get that on there, and make sure you put the keeper on there. And I used, for the most part, an entire tub of grease because I really wanted to pack the bearings and everything in good grease. I'm gonna do the same thing here. Started out with a proverbial stir stick. Not really a big Starbucks fan unless you need a $6 cup of coffee, but they do have a nice selection of stir sticks in their coffee bar. So I usually liberate a few of those on the rare occasion that I actually go to one of those places. So let's see, the top half of this, and I put it together to make the gasket, so I'm gonna have to just knock it apart. Handy to have a rubber mallet handy. And the arm, these arms, by the way, are different. So this one is part number 14553, and this would be on the driver's side. 15442 is on the passenger side. So like I say, what I did the last time, this already has the race in it, is making sure I got that oriented the right way. I just plopped that right down on that race like that. And then I took the underside and I mated it up with this bottom side. There's little guide pins on here to make sure you got that kind of going in the right direction. And these are, I think, intentionally designed to be a little tough to get in there, because that's what aligns these guide pins with those bolts. And a 5/8 inch socket pretty much gets everything except for the little 1/2 inch bolts that hold the other piece over here on. Now might be a good time to get this bearing set in here. Bearing goes on this shaft. And I had to kind of bang the other side on to get it. And a standard size socket seems to be around about the spark plug socket. Seems to be about the right size to get that seated up in there properly, which it now is. And then the little race goes in on top of it. Nice snug fit. Okay. And then this cap, which is the one that does not have the grease dirt, goes on the bottom and has these 4 screws. And I took these shims off. There's 4 and 3. So I'm gonna put the, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, 4 and 3. So I'm gonna put the fewer shims on the bottom just because there's no gasket there, and there is grease In the manual, it actually says this should be SAE 90 gear weight, but I don't really like gear lube on bearings, so I'm not going with what the manual says. I'm putting grease in there. And my thread sealant apparently is locked up. Apparently I thread sealed so much stuff that it why I have these fancy red-handed Cutco cigarettes. Remedy that situation corrected. Say this is does have potential for this. These holes go all the way through, so it does have the potential for grease to leak out of the bottom, oil or grease, particularly if you went back with SA 90, which is what the manual said. There are seals in there, so in theory that would keep the lube in, but grease is going to be a lot less likely to get hot and seep out of there. I also had a fair amount of trouble getting the I guess that would be called preload on the other side correct on this bearing. But after I took it apart and reassembled it twice, then pretty much got that worked out, and I got the original shims set up to go back in and work. Alright, so now that I got that, I'm going to take and tighten these two half moons together. Okay, shim made. I didn't video it because I didn't know how long that was going to take me and how many tries, but it actually just took one. So when I take these shims and mic them, they come out to about 34 thousandths, all stacked up. Yeah, right at 34 thousandths. I had some 10 thousandths shim stock, and these shims are, I think they came in 2, 5, and 10 thousandths, and this one is 10. This one is 10. This one is about 6. Call it 5. And this one's clearly 5. So I got 2 10s and 2 5s. So that's 30 thousandths, and I had a piece of brass shim stock that is right at 30 thousandths. So I just made one of these, and honestly, I don't think you can make this without a mill. So I took a piece of stock, sandwiched it between two pieces of plywood, clamped it down. I drilled these 4, but I did them digitally with measurements off of these holes, so that, because this is very precision, so I did it where these holes would exactly line up. Then I found the center, and I used a bimetal bit to bore that hole, and that hole is, I don't know how big it is, but whatever it is, it's perfect size. Looks like it's about 2 1/8. But anyway, I got it pretty much done, spot on. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the 30 thousandths shim, the new 30 thousandths, in 110, and that's going to give me about 6 thousandths bigger than what it was. And we'll tighten that up and see what that feels like. So we're going to plop that back down on there like so. Plop that down on there. 2 cones inserted that do not have any apparent use, other than to make it hard to get it on and off. kind of tighten this down a little bit on all four corners as you go, because with these nylon nuts you can't really feel how much tension you're getting, and I really don't want to break one of those ears off, as I'm assuming that is another unobtainium part. And I think that's just, about perfect. Kind of like that. Okay, I'm gonna call that baked. I just realized, like I did on the other side, I didn't get this handy dandy thing on there before I put that together. I'm assuming that will not go up on there. I'm gonna be sure and get that on before I did this, and somehow or another I managed to get sidetracked and not do that. So I could split the gasket, but I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and take the bottom half back off and put this gasket on first. Lessons learned. Actually, it wasn't learned because I did the same thing on the other one. So I'm going to go ahead and take that. Look live, Shackleton off. Videos roll back on, and then we'll go again. So now that I got that proverbially unfucked, I took this off, put this gasket on there, and now I'm going to put these little felt seals on there. I got the, I can't remember where I got these felt seals, but anyway, I got them. I couldn't find anything else for it, but I did find those little felt seals, which is pretty handy. When I did this on the other side, the middle ones, the top middle ones, have just a nut. I now realize it's going to be nearly impossible to get that nut in there with that arm on there. It's on there. I don't think a socket's going to get on there, but we can try it. I'm going to have to take that arm off. And then so there's two short ones, and then there's two long ones that have this little hole where a safety wire was in. And the two longer ones have to also go through these little felts that sit on here and seal up that corner. So I better put the bottom one on to go too. These felts are kind of precarious in here. Another short one. And they do go with the curve inside, which is a little bit counterintuitive. So, like I put the two top and bottom on the outside, then I figured out how to squirrel these in there, and it was kind of tough going to get them all sandwiched up in there where they're supposed to go, because these felts are kind of thick. Well, that one feels like it went in there. And I try to get those holes lined up where they're nice and straight. And when you put these felts on here, it really tightens this thing up, so it's best to put these on after you get the lash set, like you like it on the bushings. Okay, and when you put all that on there, that thing really tightens that front end up really solid. So now I think we got all that on there. Now it's time to work on this this fancy axle. By the way, I've got 3 shims for sale. This axle, I think I actually put that on after I did this. So this backing plate is what goes on next, and there's a fancy gasket here, pre-made. I kind of put that on gently because doesn't have a lot of room in the bolt holes. I want to tear one out. Alright, so that goes on there. These backing plates, they're the same, but this hole right here is offset. And I jacked with this on the other side because the picture shows on that side the brake was to the rear, and I couldn't figure out how that would work, but they are exactly the same. So on one of these, the emergency adjustment thing is going to go a little bit towards the front, the other one is going to go a little bit towards the back. So we put that on there, then we put this on there. I must have put this axle in. Did I put this axle in before? Yeah, I must have put this in next. All right, so I'm gonna get the axles. This is the part where it says, put this little snap ring on it, the new snap ring / key ring. Goes right on like that. And then this has this crazy 5-ball setup planetary orbiter in here. And when you mesh these gears up where this goes, that's it. Believe it or not, that's what the manual says to do. So then what I did was pack this full of grease, which was a little bit of a messy job. So I'm gonna go get some gloves and pack this up with grease. And then we're gonna slide this axle housing up in there. Okay, we got that greased up. The other one of these went in pretty simply. There's a new seal up in that axle housing. I will say there's just not a whole hell of a lot of clearance. Okay. Boom shakalaka. There it goes. All right, that was a little harder than the other one, but not altogether impossible. And probably ought to lop a little grease. Actually, the other thing I did is I took this, lost my plastic knife. Where'd my plastic knife go? So I took this plastic knife and I just filled this cavity with grease. Extent I could get it in there. That's where that lower bearing is. There's a bunch of grease in that. I tried to pack that as much as possible, but I don't think it hurts to have too much grease in here because there's There is a grease zerk up on the top, but it's got to go past that bushing to get to it. So it's not a real easy way to get grease in this thing after the fact. So I'm going to just make sure this is plenty lubed up with. So when this gets hot and this grease gets loose, it'll find its way where it needs to go. All right, that ought to do it. I'll put that over in the Shackleton pile. And then what I did before is I put just a little dollop. This only spins when the four-wheel drive is engaged, which is probably not going to be a great deal. Okay. Now we're ready to slide this piece on there. Flat piece to the top. There's a little bronze bushing in there. So that goes on there. This piece goes on here. Little dust cover. And we got 4 or 5 more of these. 5 more. Okay, now I believe it is time to put the hub on. And this is the other one that I went ahead and just plugged this up with grease. Honestly, there was this much grease in here when I took it apart. It was a mess getting it cleaned out of there. Like it was a combination of grease and gear oil because the seals had gone bad. All right, that'll do it. And then, so this, I've already greased the inside gasket. Got a new seal on it. Slides up on there like so. Get my handy dandy. I'm gonna go with the handy dandy plastic knife. Put this bearing in because it's a little heavier. And the regulation Starbucks. Okay, that sits right up in there like that. And then this, these nuts, I took this apart. This nut has this little dot on here. See the little dot right on the edge? That dot, once you get it in there where you like the lash, then this washer goes in with a groove and locks on that nut, and then this nut locks it all together. So first thing to do is put the one on there with the little ball sticking out. And I tried to get a proper socket for this. OTC makes pretty much all the actual sockets, and they don't make this socket in an 8-point. It's 2 5/8. I ordered it. The website said, had a picture of an 8-pointed socket, 2 5/8, with a 6-point socket. And so I ordered it, but when it got here, it was the wrong one. It was a 6-pointed socket. It was indeed 2 5/8, but it was a 6-pointed socket. For some reason, I have a hard time getting this nut started. So I called them, and they said, yeah, it was a stock image on the socket ad showing the 8-point, and that they don't make an 8-point. There's no burr on that. Oh, clearly wasn't holding my mouth right. And the only thing I could do on this one last time was take this fancy screwdriver and just gently tap it in using that little round tip. Oh, we got a long ways to go. I just set this up where it didn't have any wiggle. It's got a little bit of resistance, just kind of like you would a trailer wheel. Feels about right. And then this thing, there's a groove at the top. There we go. And then this washer, this nut has been chiseled on and off from the prior people who didn't have the proper socket either. So I don't really have any other way of doing it other than the way they did it, which is get it up there where it goes and take a chisel, put it into one ear of the nut. This is, by the way, how I got it off. Okay. It's got good resistance. I think that's good. So the next thing is this is the little 4-wheel drive lock-in mechanism, which spins, has an O-ring right there, and there's no potential for fluids to come out of there. So I don't think you need to seal these bolts. None of these bolts had lock washers on them when I took it off. And it just slides on there. Some of you may be thinking, why is he putting that together with it painted? Why not just assemble the thing and paint it all together? And I kind of like the look of gaskets. I don't really like, I got started building cars when I was about 13, building Model A's. And Model A's were, the motors were assembled after they were painted. So none of the gaskets have paint on them on a Model A. And I don't know, I got started with that habit, and I just don't like to paint gaskets. I'm not sure what I'm going to do on the motor, because the motor, as I understand it, was painted assembled, so the gaskets would be painted. But I don't really like the look of painted gaskets. I kind of like the look of just seeing a little edge of a gasket. And the other thing is that I don't like to paint all the nuts and bolts. So I went to a lot of trouble to parkerize these with a manganese phosphate. Again, back in the Model A days, they had bolts on them that were called Raven head bolts, had a oblong kind of dome shape on them. All the engine bolts were Raven head bolts. Really cool bolts. And those bolts were never painted. The engines were assembled after they were painted, and they all have had Raven finish on them, which best I can tell was the same thing as manganese phosphate. Gun makers used to parkerize AR-15s, M1 Grands, etc. And just makes a nice black finish. It will eventually corrode, just like the original bolts would have corroded. It would eventually have corroded, but kind of like that look. And then once you get that in there, there's a little C-clip. What I had to do earlier was pull this axle out a little bit. This one may be. This one is actually out far enough to get the clip on there. So there's a little C-clip right here. And this keeps this axle from floating up too far into that differential hub. And there's a little C-clip. With the right pliers, that's fairly easy to drop into that little groove. Just want to make sure it's seated. Okay, so with that, the last thing to do is on these hubs. I had a hell of a time getting this thing figured out. So this is the powertrain locking hub, and this goes, see if I remember how to do it here. No, this goes like this. So when you engage it, I think what happens when you engage is it pushes that thing in and locks it into place. Otherwise it jumps down into there. And this little spring sits up in there with this. There's a small diameter, big diameter. The big diameter goes in there, and this goes in here. And then on these screws, there's a little Torx head. There were Phillips. There's a little Torx head. I think you can see that with a dot in the middle. And then there were Phillips. So the Torx head was on the outside of the mechanism, and the Phillips was on the inside. And what I did on the other side, I had a really hard time getting this lined up and in there. In this deal, there's a ring. Let me make sure I got this going right. Let's see. It's gonna go just like that. So when I put this thing in there, these screws also have their special screws with this little machine down area. So I marked with a Sharpie where these holes line up on the top of this. This is after about an hour of fucking with this, by the way. So I put that on there. And those Sharpie marks let me line up these holes. And then I pushed it in far enough to get a couple of drifts in there. Allow me to move the camera a little closer. So what I did is I put this in here, and it doesn't go quite to the bottom. And then once you get that thing lined up, should be able to put a pin all the way through there. So then I took you gotta use the Torx head, and I put that in there. Kind of need another drift. So I got that set in there. What I'm really going to do is hold this right where that goes. And if it goes in there and seats like it's supposed to, it should go find its hole and go all the way in. Okay, there you have it. That's the locking piece. And so the Phillips screws go right in here, and those sit down in that groove to hold this thing in place. And there's an O-ring right around there that make a little seal. So these are both ready to go, but originally they had black painted on in here. So I'm gonna get my little 3-hair brush out and see if I can fill that up with some black. Other than that, I think we've pretty much got it done. Everything seems to be working right. It's got a nice little bit of resistance. We'll put the tie rod end on here, and then next we'll go put the brakes in place. So thanks for watching, and have a good day.
Download the Resto-Rat app today to begin managing, tracking, and documenting your restoration project.